Local athletes, local events, local artists, local history. You're watching Clarksville Community Network.
We were very close to a nuclear war. Can't help but be afraid that you might be a target.
The atomic age was born. There is no denying that since that moment, the shadow of the atom bomb has been across all our lives.
It's just an interesting time frame. You know, you're dealing with a lot of kid stuff back then, and then you're infused with adult issues.
I look back and think they were trying to scare us. You got to be ready, you got to be ready.
In less than 3 hours, an H-bomb might fall over Portland.
The Cold War defined my generation's childhood and teenage years. The tension that was developing between the Soviet Union and the United States.
Whether it was the Cuban Missile Crisis or when JFK was assassinated, and the idea that, well, war is imminent.
This is the force that can destroy our world unless we find the road to peace.
We're never not going to be living in the nuclear age. We will always be living in the nuclear age. Where we lived in this part of the country, we would be a potential target for a nuclear attack. You didn't walk around feeling like you had a target on your back, but at the same time, because we lived near a large military installation, you always felt like, well, you know, we have to be aware that something might come our way if something really big happened.
My dad worked with Lockheed Aircraft Company in Marietta, Georgia. And of course, they were making airplanes for the government. And our concern was that during that time, you know, if Cuba, Soviet Union, were to launch an attack, that area that we lived in would be likely a major target because of the production of the aircraft.
Well, I was born in the District of Columbia 6 years after the end of World War II, and grew up in the District of Columbia. Then we moved to Northern Virginia. We would drive past the Pentagon, go into town. I think if you'd grown up in and around Clarksville, it would have been a much different atmosphere. Again, much like people who've lived in New York for years and have never been to the Statue of Liberty, you kind of take certain things for granted.
My dad was military with the 65th Infantry out of Puerto Rico. Went to World War I, and then they went to World War II as a unit from Puerto Rico. I know my dad himself was Southern Italy and into France. 3rd grade, I could have been 4th grade, 5th grade, right through there in Germany. In Germany, for sure, there was a concern being so close to the Russian border.
Being next to a military base, aware that things were happening there. You know, we saw the planes, we heard the munitions and so forth.
Especially in Oregon. I was in 1st and 2nd grade in Oregon. They showed this to all the kids in Oregon. By the time I got here, it didn't seem like I can remember atomic drills. I remember the tornado drills. But we did exactly the same thing. We watched the 60 millimeter with sound, and that running reel, you could hear that throughout the whole movie.
CD, Civil Defense, oh my goodness.
I remember in schools we would be shown film strips about safety or in case of some type of attack. They were pretty straightforward. You know, a lot of them showed what a nuclear bomb could do in terms of how it would affect a city or community.
The chance of your being hurt by an atomic bomb is slight.
Most of them, though, were really showing ways to protect yourself.
It's a bomb. Duck and cover.
In school, we often were shown films, film projectors, the old movies and so forth. Some of them were repetitive. We had seen them since the first grade, and we got to see them again.
Initially, they would have us get under our desks and basically scrunch up as small as we possibly could. The funny thing, I mean, in retrospect, it's funny, the teachers would always say, "No talking, you can't talk, please don't talk," as if somehow the enemy and their plane are they'll find out where we are if we whisper something to each other. I mean, we just thought that was nuts. But the other thing was the desks were so small, and I was tall at a very young age. I was 6 feet tall by the time I was 12. So I couldn't actually fit underneath my desk.
First, you duck, and then you cover.
There was a turtle by the name of Bert, and the turtle was very alert. When danger threatened him, he never got hurt. He knew just what to do. He'd duck and cover.
We'd see it early in the school year, we'd see it later in the school year. A cartoon turtle is explaining to us how we're going to escape death. It had a real kind of unreal feel to it.
I remember enjoying the animations. They were like, yeah, this is cool, because we liked Saturday morning cartoons. Mighty Mouse and all that. That was our staple. I do miss that now. There's no more Saturday morning cartoons. The animation of the atomic bomb blowing up, that wasn't scary. That was cool. I didn't think it was scary. It did not occur to me that your skin would be melted off your bones or something like that. It just exciting.
The result? A chain reaction.
Not in a gruesome way, but like something's happening besides learning is going on here. And
going down and getting under your chair and covering your head, you were not always concerned about the severity of the times. And basically, if they told you that's what you need to do, that's what you did. You weren't always sure why. Being in public school, I guess that was all you could do. Something is better than doing nothing. I guess to give a sense of survival, this is what we're gonna do. This is how we're gonna do it.
The duck and cover routine, get under your school desk, put your head between your knees in a kind of a fetal position, get under something that's a hard surface. So we would do those, and in some ways it was kind of fun, but it was also, you took it seriously, that it was something that, you didn't ever want to have to experience, but it's kind of like doing a fire drill at your school. You kind of did those things routinely.
To go from having a fire drill in the 3rd grade to having an air raid drill in the 4th grade, it didn't seem like that much of a jump. The main thing we knew is that we're going to get out of class for 15 minutes.
Wait for the all clear.
Watching at that time what was the most accurate way they could capture something like that. They would set up cameras and show the direct result of a nuclear blast. Was a mannequin, but what represented a human body, and if you were within certain distance away from the center of the blast, it would do this. If you were, another distance away, it would do something else. But it was pretty startling.
I'm guessing I probably saw it when I was, 7 or 8 years old.
The blast's blinding flash silhouettes observers 7 miles away.
There were all kinds of public affairs shows on local television, and you'd see clips of that and, the impact of a nuclear bomb.
it's amazing I don't know how they could capsulize the film so that it would survive and they could still see the mannequins being blown away. Walls of buildings blown away. How did they preserve that film through irradiation?
There wasn't any trickery there. That was just straight up capturing the data that was happening, and you know, that's what happened. And I'm seeing telephone poles laid over on their side and houses peeled apart, you know, just from the sheer blast effect. That was pretty scary stuff.
Sundays, holidays, vacation time, we must be ready every day, all the time, to do the right thing if the atomic bomb explodes. Duck and cover.
It's almost comical to look back and see that, but at the time I'm sure they did not know what to do with the masses.
Covering your head with a newspaper or a sheet of material might give you a false sense of security.
If fallout settles on your food, the food itself is not harmed, since radiation damages only living tissue.
I remember them talking about you got to wipe the lids off the cans. You can't eat your can if you don't clean the lid. It really explained, or at least to our, on our level of thinking. 6, 7-year-olds. We're not thinking, well, I don't even know how to use a can opener.
Although fallout can be deadly, your chances of avoiding damage from it are much better if you follow the directions we have given you.
It's so memorable to think back in the early 60s when the whole Cuban Missile Crisis was going on, and there was this big push to build fallout shelters.
We didn't have a fallout shelter. We hadn't talked about having one before that. We did have a basement, but it was by no means equipped as a fallout shelter, and I don't know if it would have been able to even made it into a fallout shelter, considering what all might have been needed. One of the reasons my parents thinking that if we had a fallout shelter and our neighbors didn't, we could not let them into our space because, you have limited amount of space, food, everything. And my parents said they just couldn't do that.
Of course, downtown there were fallout shelter signs and so forth, and we were aware that things could happen, things could change. There was a company, FOMO Hawk Company, and they were offering fallout shelters that could be built in your backyard. They were different sizes and they had ventilation tubes so that you could be down there for quite a long time. You had to stock in food, supplies, water, all types of things. And the person who had the fallout shelter in Beach Haven, from what people say when they saw it, they had a lot of food stockpiled in there for the eventual possibility of something happening. And a local builder who everybody knows the name of Cecil Morgan, he was one of the people that offered this for sale in your yard.
I didn't hear about anybody building fallout shelters until the 60s. I do remember that somebody said to me, or said to a classroom, we're in between these mountains and they could offer us some kind of protection.
My dad brought home these booklets, these pamphlets, that had plans on how to build fallout shelter, and size-wise and what to store in it. My dad and I went down to the basement at our house in Annandale, Virginia, and we picked out a corner where we could put something here, and he actually brought home these 2 big barrels of water that were marked potable water on the side. They just sat there, and finally, the pamphlets with the plans for the fallout shelter were suddenly in the stack of old newspapers. And I went to my father and I said, aren't we going to build a fallout shelter? Because in the back of my mind I thought, what could be a better place to play than inside a fallout shelter? It's like a little house. He said, son, I kind of looked at the logistics here. If there's a war, the first target for the Russians is going to be Washington, D.C. And if it's Washington, D.C., it doesn't matter how many fallout shelters there are in Annandale, Virginia, we're all going to be vaporized. So he kind of laughed it off, and that was the end of that.
I saw more humor in my mom's interpretation of this. I don't know, she had a funny quip for stuff like that. Back then, everybody was a prepper. Everybody canned their own food during the summer and fall and had it for the winter. We didn't think of it as prepping. Grandma canned all the fruit and vegetables, and we ate them all winter.
We never built the fallout shelter. There were friends of ours who did, and of course, they would turn them into things like pantries and toy closets and things like that, but I still kind of, in the back of my mind, I thought we should have built one because it would have been really cool.
I don't think I remember ever feeling really fearful or scared of it. Later, when I realized, what it could do, I still didn't get that fearful because there's nothing you can do about it. The whole idea of this is how you'll survive. They didn't guarantee it, but it was believed that you could. Now, there were people that, we remember we were reading about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and stuff like that, and there were survivors, people who actually survived. But for the most part, if you were in ground zero or within a few miles of that, you were gone. There was no duck and cover going to save you. In a tornado, you can duck and cover. Earthquake, you can get under a door frame. But atomic bomb, if you're far enough away, you'll survive.
I was probably 10 years old when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, and my father was active duty in the military at Fort Campbell at the time, and I remember the high state of alert that the entire post and all the surrounding communities were extremely aware of. Convoys were lined up along Highway 41A between Hopkinsville and Fort Campbell as if they were going somewhere. Cuban Missile Crisis obviously was as close as I recall us ever coming to some type of confrontation that might have developed into a nuclear event.
Grandparents who lived in Gower, Missouri, it was a little town, 300 people. They were members of what was called the Ground Observer Corps. Now at the time, I really didn't understand what that meant. I went to see them and they said that they were out there to watch for enemy airplanes. And again, this is like, okay. So it didn't really hit me at the time what that meant. And it was a volunteer organization of civilians under the auspices of the Air Force. People who volunteered in small towns and big towns, cities, to stand on top of buildings and to watch for planes that did not meet the description of the airplanes that the United States was using, so it had to be expected. And if they spotted something, then they would call that into what was called the filter center in a larger town, and then that could be investigated from there on out. At the Ground Observer Corps in Gower, Missouri, that two women had seen an airplane that they couldn't identify, and so somehow or another in this particular document that got listed as a UFO. So I said, my grandparents or my grandmother saw a UFO. My grandparents never talked about that period, but it's because I didn't ask. But again, there are a lot of things that happen when we're younger, and later than when those people are no longer with us, and we think, oh, I wish I'd asked them, all these questions.
I was selling newspapers during that time. I was a paper boy. We would know what the headlines were that day. I remember the day Kennedy was assassinated, our paper delivery guy was like 2 or 3 hours late because they had held the presses and did a whole new reprint. As soon as I got off the truck, they were waiting for me. I had to wait for an hour for the truck to come back and pick me up because I was out of papers within 5 minutes.
We weren't aware of what actually went on at the birdcage at Fort Campbell until it was declassified. I mean, everybody had suspicions about that was probably some type of arsenal or something of nature that had to do with atomic armaments.
I remember my father going out and hunting deer at Fort Campbell and him talking about the bird cage, but he never told us what it was for. I knew not to ask what it was because that was something that we did. We didn't ask questions when there was something we considered to be secret.
My father was somehow connected with it. I don't remember exactly what it was, but he was connected with that in some way. And I remember, he very seldom, we didn't know anything about it. He just would say, the birdcage, and we knew what he meant. Look back on that now and think, well, we may have been a lot more of a target than I ever thought we were.
America's defense today of necessity is on land, on sea, and in the air. But its greatest threat will be from space. The intercontinental ballistic missile traveling above the atmosphere at speeds of almost 5 miles per second.
The way they had to be done with individual cell animation in the old school style, where every frame is a different illustration that had to be strung together then. Those were time consuming and very hands-on, very elaborate. And then of course the actual cinematographic versions where you're using actors and people, those had to be produced just like you would any other film. You had props and actors and sets, and all that still required. I'm looking at some of these films that, fairly elaborate productions.
I have to ask myself, if they were to remake these films now, would they use recognizable actors? Clearly, they'd be in color. I think the black and white aspect of the old films makes them more effective now than they likely were then. If you're into things like film noir, some of them are a little dark. And I think that if you were to make these films now, there would be less of this, duck and cover business and make sure your affairs are in order type thing. I think we know pretty much now that escaping some kind of illness or instant death from a nuclear weapon is kind of futile. It's one of those things that is, if it happens, it happens, but no one's talking about building fallout shelters anymore. And if one nuclear bomb is dropped here, there's going to be 1 or 2 dropped over there. So it's the idea that these things exist as deterrents to war, not actually as weapons of war.
Today reminds me of the same procedure for tornado. Cover your head and get down low. Here we are looking at that same subject matter from what's happening overseas. That is still a possibility. That is still something that could happen. It seems like a long ways off. 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it was a long ways off, and now we're looking at it. This is a possibility. This is coming to be more in the making as every day goes by. And maybe it's time to think about things like that once in a while. Just say, hey, things happen, things can happen. What are you going to do? What's your family going to do?
We're not doing these kind of films anymore, but maybe, there should be some communication to the general public that these things are still out there and can happen. And how do we prepare for it?
Cut the danger of radioactive fallout. Learn what to do.
Once the Cuban Missile Crisis ended and the idea that we were going to be attacked and bombed, that thought just kind of left our minds. It was, as I got a little bit older, I think my main priority was, avoiding the war in Vietnam, which really wasn't much of a thing, although it was going on in the early 60s. But by the time I was getting out of high school, I didn't want any part of having to wear a green suit and carry a gun.
I think people thought of the Cold War by what their background was. I think if you were in the military, you saw it one way. If you were older, you saw it another way. And being young, of course, I saw it a different way.
Actually, the survival of this entire nation depends upon the ability of federal, state, and local governments to carry out their responsibilities in the event of a massive nuclear attack.
Hard to imagine how you would safeguard against every situation. You can't, safeguard against every situation, but as long as you have some fundamental, here's what we need to do when something happens, that can make a difference in people being okay.
If a person lives long enough, you experience those changes. I've lived long enough to experience a lot that changes. Where we are in time does impact our perspective of things.
We've all lived through a pandemic the past 2 years, and yes, the world was seriously impacted by this, and a lot of people did not survive it, and there is a sadness to those situations. But as a human being, you know, you have to get up every day thinking that the world can be a better place if we all help make it a better place.
For current and exclusive content, subscribe to CDE Lightband, connecting you at the speed of light.